The ocean has always swallowed secrets, but on July 20, 1960, it gave one back to the world. At 12:39 in the afternoon, off the coast of Cape Canaveral, Florida, a slim black rocket weighing nearly 15 tons erupted from beneath the surface of the Atlantic, climbed into the summer sky, and vanished downrange. There had been no warning. There had been no aircraft, no surface ship, no land-based silo. The missile had simply emerged from empty water as though the sea itself had decided to fire back. Inside a steel hull cruising at launch depth, the captain of the United States submarine George Washington picked up a message form and wrote a single sentence to the President of the United States. "Polaris from out of the deep to target. Perfect." Those 9 words announced something the world had never seen before. A ballistic missile carrying a thermonuclear warhead fired from a submerged submarine with enough range to reach a city more than 1,000 miles away. The Americans understood immediately what they had created. Rear Admiral William Raborn, the man who had driven the Polaris program against years of doubt and resistance, called it the most significant happening in weaponry since the day the airplane first flew. He was not exaggerating. In the weeks and months that followed, Soviet naval planners would study what had happened off the Florida coast with mounting concern. The strategic equation had begun to shift in a way that could not be reversed. Until that afternoon in July, nuclear deterrence depended on things that could be found and destroyed. Bombers parked on runways, missiles standing in fixed concrete silos, ships floating on the open sea. Every leg of American nuclear power could, in theory, be hunted down and eliminated in a surprise attack. But a submarine moving silently somewhere in the ocean, hidden inside tens of millions of square miles of water, was a target that could not be located, could not be tracked, and could not be destroyed before it fired back. This was the ultimate insurance policy against nuclear annihilation. Strategists called it second strike capability, the certainty that even after losing every city, every airbase, every silo, the United States would still have enough surviving firepower to deliver apocalyptic retaliation. And that certainty, that grim mathematical promise, became the foundation of nuclear deterrence for the rest of the 20th century. The Soviets understood it too. They had to. By the late 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a strategic confrontation that had never existed before in human history. Each side possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy the other many times over. Each side knew that the only thing preventing catastrophe was the certainty of mutual destruction. But that certainty rested on shaky ground. The American Strategic Air Command, the bomber fleet that carried most of the nation's nuclear weight, had a fundamental vulnerability that defense planners could not ignore. Its bases were known. Its airfields were soft targets. Its aircraft needed time to take off, time to climb, and time to fly thousands of miles to their targets. A Soviet first strike, delivered by ballistic missiles arriving in less than 30 minutes, might destroy most of those bombers on the ground before they could even start their engines. The land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles being developed at the same time, the Atlas and the Titan, faced exactly the same problem. They sat in fixed locations. Their coordinates could be calculated. Their silos could be targeted. The whole American deterrent rested on a small number of vulnerable points that an enemy could, given enough warheads and enough nerve, attempt to wipe out in a single coordinated blow. 2 years before Sputnik, a confidential study had already raised the alarm. In February 1955, a panel of scientists led by Dr. James Killian of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology delivered a report to President Eisenhower titled "Meeting the Threat of Surprise Attack." The Killian panel concluded, in language that no one in the White House could ignore, that the United States was dangerously vulnerable to a Soviet first strike, and that without urgent action, a future surprise attack could be decisive against American retaliatory forces. Buried inside the report's recommendations was a single sentence that opened the door to everything that came later. It urged that both land basing and ship basing be considered for the new ballistic missiles the country needed to develop. That sentence was the formal opening for a Navy missile. Then, on October 4, 1957, the Soviets launched a small metal sphere called Sputnik into orbit around the Earth. The world heard its radio beep on shortwave receivers from London to Tokyo, and the people who understood ballistic missiles understood instantly what Sputnik really meant. The rocket that had placed Sputnik in orbit was, in essence, an intercontinental ballistic missile. The Soviets had just demonstrated that they could deliver a payload halfway around the world. American defense planners who had been quietly worried became publicly alarmed. The president received another confidential study, the Gaither Report, in November 1957. It concluded that within 2 years the Soviet Union would have enough missiles to render strategic air command almost completely vulnerable. The Gaither panel called for hardening, for dispersal, and for the rapid deployment of submarine-launched and land-based ballistic missiles. The report leaked to the Washington Post on December 20, 1957, in a story by the journalist Chalmers Roberts. The phrase missile gap entered the American political vocabulary. The fear was concrete. The fear was justified. The fear demanded a solution. And the United States Navy, which had been pushing for years to claim a piece of the strategic deterrent mission, suddenly found itself with the political opening it had been waiting for. The Navy had been building toward this moment longer than most Americans realized. After the Second World War, the service had watched as the newly independent Air Force claimed strategic bombing as its exclusive domain. In 1949, the cancellation of the supercarrier United States, killed by Air Force lobbying, had been a humiliation that senior naval officers never forgot. They wanted back into the game. They wanted ships and submarines that could deliver nuclear weapons. They wanted a seat at the table where the future of American strategy was being decided. In the early 1950s, the Navy worked on cruise missiles like the Regulus, which surfaced submarines could fire at coastal targets. The Regulus was an interesting weapon. It was a winged, subsonic missile, essentially a small, unmanned jet aircraft, fired from a hangar mounted on the deck of a submarine after the boat surfaced. It could carry a nuclear warhead about 500 miles. 5 different submarines eventually carried the Regulus, and beginning in October 1959, they conducted 40 deterrent patrols in the North Pacific over the course of nearly 5 years, providing the Navy's first true sea-based nuclear deterrent. But cruise missiles were slow, vulnerable, and limited in range. They flew at the speed of a propeller airliner. They could be shot down by ordinary fighters. Worse, the firing submarine had to surface, open its hangar, raise the missile to launch position, and remain on the surface until the weapon was away. During those minutes, the boat was helpless, visible to radar and aircraft, and impossible to defend. What the Navy really needed was a ballistic missile, a true strategic weapon, something that could compete with the Air Force on equal terms, something that could be fired from beneath the waves with the submarine never showing herself. In November 1955, the Department of Defense ordered the Army and the Navy to cooperate on a new intermediate-range ballistic missile called Jupiter. The Army would design the missile. The Navy would figure out how to launch it from a ship. On paper, this looked like progress. In practice, it was a nightmare. The Jupiter was a liquid-fueled rocket. It used kerosene and liquid oxygen, both of which had to be loaded into the missile shortly before launch. Liquid oxygen is colder than -183 degrees Celsius. It boils away constantly. It eats through metal. And kerosene, when mixed with leaking oxidizer, is a catastrophe waiting to happen. Putting that combination on a moving warship was risky. Putting it on a submarine was insane. Beyond the chemistry, the Jupiter was simply too big. The missile weighed about 160,000 pounds and stood over 58 feet tall. There was no submarine on Earth that could carry it without being designed entirely around the missile. By the summer of 1956, Navy engineers were quietly furious. They were being forced to develop a launching system for a weapon that would never reasonably go to sea. They needed a different missile. They needed solid fuel. And they needed a warhead small enough to fit on top of a missile that was actually small enough for a submarine to carry. That summer, an unusual meeting took place at a small conference center near Woods Hole, Massachusetts, called Nobska Point. The National Academy of Sciences had organized a study on anti-submarine warfare, with some of the brightest scientists and naval officers in the country gathered for 10 weeks of analysis. On July 18, 1956, the discussion turned to nuclear weapons. A man named Edward Teller stood up to speak. Teller was the physicist often called the father of the hydrogen bomb. He worked at the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory in Livermore, California, and he had spent his career thinking about how nuclear warheads could be made smaller, lighter, and more powerful. The Navy officers in the room expected him to confirm what they already believed, that any warhead small enough to fit on a submarine-launched missile would have to be small in yield as well, perhaps a few hundred kilotons at most. Instead, Teller asked them a question that changed everything. Why use a 1958 warhead in a 1965 weapons system? The room went quiet. Teller continued. He told them that within 5 years, his laboratory could produce a thermonuclear warhead with a yield of about 1 megaton, weighing only a fraction of what the Jupiter warhead weighed. He was offering the Navy a weapon that did not yet exist, based on physics that had not yet been fully tested. But he was Edward Teller. And when Teller spoke about nuclear weapons, the Navy listened. With Teller's promise on the table, everything changed. If a 1 megaton warhead could weigh just a few hundred pounds, then the missile carrying it could be much smaller. If the missile was small enough, it could use solid fuel instead of liquid. If it used solid fuel, it could be safe to carry on a submarine. The chain of impossibilities began to unlock. By December 1956, the Secretary of Defense had given the Navy permission to leave the Jupiter program and pursue its own solid-fuel ballistic missile, designed from the keel up to be fired from a submerged submarine. The project needed a name. Someone, no one is entirely sure who, suggested Polaris, the North Star, the steady point of light by which sailors had navigated for thousands of years. The name stuck. To run the program, the Navy needed someone willing to break rules. The Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Arleigh Burke, chose Rear Admiral William Francis Raborn, Jr., known throughout the fleet as Red Raborn. Burke himself was no ordinary admiral. He had earned the nickname 31-Knot Burke during the Pacific War for the speed of his destroyer squadron at the Battle of Cape St. George in 1943. He had served as Chief of Naval Operations from August 1955 and had spent his early months in the job concluding that the Navy could not afford to be left out of the strategic deterrent mission a second time. He saw Polaris as the program that would secure the Navy's place in the nuclear age, and he was prepared to spend his political capital protecting it. Raborn was a Texan, a naval aviator, a graduate of the United States Naval Academy class of 1928. He had commanded an aircraft carrier during the Korean War. In May 1954, while commanding the carrier Bennington, he had handled a catastrophic catapult explosion that killed 103 sailors and officers and injured over 200 more, with such calm under pressure that he had earned a reputation as the man you wanted in the worst possible moment. Raborn was not a missile expert. He was not an engineer, but he was something rarer in the United States Navy of the 1950s. He was a manager who could move fast. Burke gave him an extraordinary mandate. Raborn would run something called the Special Projects Office, established on November 17, 1955. He would report directly to the Chief of Naval Operations and to the Secretary of the Navy, bypassing every traditional bureau in the service. He would have the authority to override any office, any captain, and any contractor that stood in his way. Raborn carried a piece of paper in his shirt pocket signed by Burke that, in his own words, gave him a kind of magic over the rest of the Navy. To handle the technical work, Raborn brought in a man named Levering Smith. Smith was a quiet, almost shy career ordnance officer who had spent 10 years at the Naval Ordnance Test Station at China Lake in the California desert, working on rockets when nobody cared about rockets. He had risen to Associate Technical Director there, an unusual posting for a serving naval officer in a role that traditionally went to civilian engineers. He understood propellants, he understood guidance, and, most importantly, he understood that solid fuel, not liquid fuel, was the only safe path forward for a weapon that would live inside a submarine. Smith would serve in the Special Projects Office for 22 years. He would oversee Polaris and its successors, Poseidon and Trident. Many engineers who worked under him said, decades later, that he was the true architect of the American submarine-launched ballistic missile force. Together, Raborn and Smith assembled a team that would attempt something the United States military had never attempted before. They would compress what should have been a 10-year development program into less than 5 years. They would design a brand new missile, a brand new warhead, a brand new submarine, and a brand new launch system, all at the same time, all in parallel, with everything depending on everything else working. The original schedule called for the first deployed Polaris by 1965. After Sputnik, that schedule was torn up. The new schedule demanded the first deployment by late 1960. 5 years of work compressed into 3. Many in Washington thought the Navy had lost its mind. The engineering challenges were almost beyond description. To build a missile small enough to fit inside a submarine, the Navy needed a new kind of solid propellant that burned hotter and faster than anything available. A company called the Atlantic Research Corporation made a discovery that defied existing theory. By loading the propellant with much more powdered aluminum than chemists had previously thought possible, they raised the energy output dramatically. Aerojet General turned that discovery into the 2-stage motors of the Polaris. The first stage burned for about a minute. The second stage finished the job and flung the warhead onto its ballistic trajectory. To guide the missile to its target, Dr. Charles Stark Draper at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology refined the inertial guidance system. Inertial guidance uses gyroscopes and accelerometers to measure exactly how a vehicle moves in space, calculating its position from the moment it leaves the ground. There is no radio link. There is no signal that can be jammed. The missile knows where it is because it has been counting every twitch of its own motion. Draper's laboratory built guidance sets that fit inside the nose of the Polaris, weighed only a few hundred pounds, and could put the warhead within a mile of its aim point after a flight of more than 1,000 miles. But there was a deeper problem that the Air Force missile programs did not have to solve. A land-based intercontinental ballistic missile sits in a silo whose exact location is surveyed to within centimeters. The Polaris would be fired from a submarine moving slowly through the open ocean. If the launching submarine did not know its own position with extreme precision, then the missile's inertial guidance system would simply carry an error from the start of flight all the way to the target. The Navy needed a new kind of navigation system. The answer was something called the Ship's Inertial Navigation System, the Mark I SINS. Built by Sperry and based on Draper's inertial principles, SINS kept track of the submarine's position even after weeks underwater, with no contact with the surface, no glimpse of the stars, no satellite signal. It compared the moving boat's accelerations against a stable internal reference and integrated those numbers thousands of times per second. By the time the captain pressed the firing key, SINS could tell the Polaris exactly where it was starting from. Then there was the problem of actually getting the missile out of a submerged submarine without killing the crew. A normal rocket motor ignited inside a steel tube under hundreds of feet of water would turn the submarine into a furnace within seconds. The Special Projects Office developed a method called cold launch. High-pressure gas generated by a small charge inside the launch tube would push the missile up through a thin diaphragm at the top of the tube, ejecting it through the surface. Only after the missile had cleared the water and was several feet into the air would its first stage ignite. From the submarine's perspective, the missile simply leaped out of the boat in a roar of bubbles, leaving an empty tube and a slightly heavier ship behind. To test all of this, the Navy needed a submarine. There was no time to design one from scratch, so in late December 1957, the Navy made a decision that became, in its own quiet way, one of the most important shipbuilding choices of the Cold War. The Electric Boat Division of General Dynamics in Groton, Connecticut, was already building an attack submarine called the Scorpion, a skipjack-class boat with a teardrop hull and the new S-5W nuclear reactor. Construction had only just begun. The Navy ordered the yard to stop, redesignate the hull, and stretch it. They would insert a 130-foot section into the middle of the boat. That section would contain 16 vertical missile tubes arranged in 2 rows of 8, the so-called Sherwood Forest that would become the standard layout for every American ballistic missile submarine that followed. The boat that emerged was renamed George Washington in honor of the first President of the United States. The hull number became SSBN 598. The original name Scorpion was given to a different attack submarine, which would later be lost with all hands in May 1968, an unrelated tragedy that has nothing to do with this story, but is worth knowing for those who come across the name. George Washington's keel had been laid as the Scorpion in late 1957. By the time the conversion was complete, she was 381 feet long, displaced about 6,700 tons submerged, and could make 25 knots beneath the surface. She was launched on June 9, 1959, sponsored by Mrs. Ollie Mae Anderson, the wife of Treasury Secretary Robert Anderson. She was commissioned on December 30, 1959, only 4 years and 1 month after Raborn took charge of special projects. To squeeze the maximum patrol time out of every boat, the Navy invented something new. 2 complete crews would be assigned to each ballistic missile submarine. While one crew was at sea, the other would be ashore training. When the boat returned to base, the crews would swap. Within weeks, the submarine would be back on patrol with fresh men. The 2 crews were called Blue and Gold after the Navy's official colors. The first Blue Crew commanding officer of George Washington was Commander James Osborn. The first Gold Crew commanding officer was Commander John from Jr. The system worked so well that every American ballistic missile submarine since has used some version of it. Behind the scenes, the politics of all this were as complicated as the engineering. Vice Admiral Hyman Rickover, the irascible father of the nuclear navy, had been deliberately kept out of the Polaris program by Burke. Rickover ran the reactor side of the Navy with an iron grip, but Burke feared that putting Polaris under Rickover would slow it down and bury it under his absolutism. Rickover, in turn, viewed the Polaris program as a competitor for nuclear-trained officers and shipyard space. The relationship between the 2 men was famously cold for the rest of their careers. The 2 great American submarine programs of the Cold War, nuclear propulsion under Rickover and ballistic missiles under Raborn and Smith, were run by men who could not stand each other, and somehow the work got done. The first test flights of the Polaris began at Cape Canaveral on September 24, 1958. The early results were brutal. The first missile, Alpha X-1, lifted off but failed to roll into proper trajectory and was destroyed by range safety. Alpha X-2 in October ignited its second stage on the launch pad, tearing the rocket apart while the first stage still burned beneath it. Alpha X-3 in December was lost when its engine bell overheated. Alpha X-4 and Alpha X-5 in early 1959 both flew erratically and were destroyed in flight. 5 missiles, 5 failures in less than 5 months. Newspapers picked up the story. Critics in Congress began asking whether the Navy's miracle weapon was a fantasy. Inside the Special Projects Office, the engineers worked through nights and weekends, tearing apart telemetry tapes, examining recovered fragments, redesigning components, and arguing fiercely over what had gone wrong. Levering Smith later said that those months tested every member of the team in a way that nothing else in his career had matched. Raborn defended the program publicly, refusing to allow the failures to be characterized as setbacks. He insisted, in testimony and in the press, that the program was learning exactly what it needed to learn, exactly when it needed to learn it. Then, on April 20, 1959, Alpha X-6 lifted off, burned cleanly through both stages, and impacted the Atlantic 300 miles downrange, exactly where the engineers had said it would. The program had its first complete success. Through 1959, the Special Projects Office continued firing missiles from Cape Canaveral and from a converted merchant ship, the Observation Island, which had been fitted with a single launch tube to test surface ship firing. Roughly half the early flights succeeded. The other half exploded, tumbled, or simply disappeared. Each failure was analyzed. Each success refined the design. By the spring of 1960, the Polaris A-1 missile, 28 feet long, 54 inches in diameter, weighing about 28,800 pounds, with a range of about 1,200 nautical miles, and a thermonuclear warhead designated W-47 was ready for its final examination. The W-47 warhead itself was a technological miracle. Developed at Livermore under Teller's overall direction, with John Foster and Harold Brown leading the design team, it weighed only about 720 pounds and yielded 600 kilotons in its initial deployed version. The first 16 production warheads were accepted by the Navy in July 1960. Just in time. On June 28, 1960, George Washington left Groton, Connecticut, and sailed south. She arrived at the Atlantic Missile Range off Cape Canaveral and loaded 2 Polaris test missiles. Rear Admiral Raborn came aboard as an observer, along with senior Special Projects officials. The submarine moved out to her launch position, slowed to barely more than a crawl, and slipped beneath the surface. At 12:39 in the afternoon on July 20, 1960, the gas generator in launch tube number 1 fired. Pressurized gas filled the space below the missile. The diaphragm at the top of the tube ruptured. The Polaris ejected upward through the seawater above the boat in a column of bubbles, broke the surface, climbed for a fraction of a second on its ejection energy alone, and then ignited its first stage motor. Witnesses on observation aircraft and ships saw a pillar of white smoke and water suddenly explode upward from the empty Atlantic, and at its tip, a slim black missile arcing into the sky. The missile flew almost exactly as designed. Its first stage burned out and separated. The second stage took over. The warhead carrier coasted ballistically toward an instrumented impact area more than 1,100 miles downrange, where it splashed down within the planned target zone. Less than 2 hours later, George Washington fired her second Polaris from another tube. That missile also performed correctly and impacted in the target area, 2 for 2, from beneath the surface. Commander Osborn drafted his message to President Eisenhower: Polaris from out of the deep to target. Perfect. 5 days later, on July 25, 1960, President Eisenhower flew to Cape Canaveral, boarded the yacht Barbara Ann, and watched another Polaris submarine, the Patrick Henry, fire her own test missile. Afterward, the president released a public statement. He said, "This demonstration exceeds in significance for the nation's security even the most optimistic predictions that I had heard about the expected efficiency of this new weapon system. I am proud of the patriotic and competent personnel who have brought about this great achievement." The wider American public still did not fully understand what had happened. But in classified briefing rooms in the Pentagon, in the Kremlin, in the headquarters of the Royal Navy, in the offices of every serious defense ministry on Earth, the meaning was understood with absolute clarity. The world had crossed a line. The age of the invisible nuclear deterrent had begun. On July 30, 1960, the Gold Crew under Commander Fromm relieved the Blue Crew aboard George Washington and duplicated the entire test, firing 2 more Polaris missiles successfully from a submerged condition. Both crews were now qualified. The submarine sailed for the Naval Weapons Station at Charleston, South Carolina, where she was loaded with her full operational complement of 16 Polaris missiles, each one carrying a 600-kiloton thermonuclear warhead. On November 15, 1960, George Washington left Charleston under Commander Osborn and the Blue Crew on the first strategic deterrent patrol in human history. She would remain submerged for 66 days, somewhere in the Atlantic, never breaking the surface, never communicating except to receive the most urgent operational signals. Inside the submarine, life followed a precise rhythm. The crew rotated through 6-hour watches around the clock. The reactor hummed quietly behind heavy shielding. The atmosphere was scrubbed of carbon dioxide and replenished with oxygen generated from seawater. Air pressure stayed close to the surface standard. The lights in the missile compartment shifted from white during day shifts to red during night shifts, helping the men maintain a normal circadian rhythm even though they could not see the sun. Meals were served 4 times a day, partly to maintain morale and partly to mark time. Movies were shown on a small projector in the crew's mess. Letters could not be sent or received. The submarine's location was known only to the captain, the navigator, and a small group of senior officers. Even the families of the men aboard did not know exactly where their husbands and fathers were. They knew only that the boat was at sea, somewhere in the ocean, doing what the boat had been built to do. She returned to base on January 21, 1961. Inside her hull, beneath the silver dolphins on each crewman's uniform, was more destructive power than every bomb dropped by every air force in the entirety of the Second World War combined. The continuous at-sea deterrent had begun. From that day forward, somewhere on Earth, at every minute of every day, there has always been at least one American ballistic missile submarine on patrol, hidden, silent, and ready. The nuclear triad was complete. The United States now possessed 3 independent legs of nuclear retaliation: bombers of Strategic Air Command, land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles in their hardened silos, and submarines like George Washington, invisible beneath the oceans of the world. Each leg covered the other's weaknesses. An enemy could not destroy them all. The mathematics of mutual assured destruction had become, for the first time, mathematically reliable. The Soviet response was a mixture of professional alarm and frustrated catch-up. Soviet naval strategists had been warning the Kremlin for years that submarines like George Washington were coming. They had been ignored. Soviet missile programs had focused on land-based rockets. Soviet submarine programs had focused on torpedo attack boats and a small number of surface-launched missile carriers, the Golf and Hotel classes, which had to come up to fire and were therefore terribly vulnerable. None of those Soviet boats could match what George Washington had just done. The first true Soviet equivalent, the Project 667A, known to the West as the Yankee class, would not be commissioned until November 1967, more than 7 years after George Washington's first patrol. The lead boat, K-137, would not begin Atlantic patrols until 1969. By the time the Yankees finally arrived, the Americans were already deploying the Polaris A-3 with 3 independent re-entry bodies and a range of 2,500 nautical miles, and were beginning work on the Poseidon C-3 with multiple independently targeted warheads. The gap between the two superpower submarine forces would never fully close. The Royal Navy, watching all of this with deep professional interest, made its own decision. Britain had been trying to develop the Blue Streak intermediate range missile and then the air-launched Skybolt to maintain its independent nuclear deterrent. Both projects ran into trouble. Blue Streak was cancelled in 1960 as a military weapon because its fixed silos were too vulnerable. Skybolt, an American air-launched ballistic missile that Britain had agreed to buy in 1960, was cancelled by the United States in late 1962 when its test flights kept failing. The cancellation was a political crisis between London and Washington because the British nuclear deterrent suddenly had no future weapon to carry it. In December 1962, at a meeting in Nassau in the Bahamas, President Kennedy and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan reached the agreement that became known as the Nassau Agreement. Under its terms, the United States would supply Polaris missiles, launch tubes, and fire control systems to the United Kingdom. The British would build their own submarines, their own warheads, and assign their force to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, with a national reservation for supreme national interest. The Polaris Sales Agreement was formally signed on April 6, 1963. 6 years later, on February 15, 1968, the British submarine Resolution fired her first Polaris off the coast of Florida. The Royal Navy would carry Polaris until 1996. Meanwhile, the Americans had already established their own forward base in Scotland. On March 3, 1961, the submarine tender Proteus moved into Holyloch, a deep-sea inlet on the western coast of Scotland, to support the growing Polaris fleet. 5 days later, the second Polaris submarine, the Patrick Henry, arrived to begin the first refit at what was officially designated Submarine Fleet Ballistic Missile Refit Site 1. From that point onward, American ballistic missile submarines were rotating through Holyloch on a permanent basis, dramatically reducing the time required to reach patrol stations within range of the Soviet Union. The forward base would remain operational for 31 years until the end of the Cold War made it unnecessary in 1992. The submarine-launched ballistic missile had become the gold standard of strategic deterrence everywhere it was understood. The Americans built 5 classes of ballistic missile submarines, totaling 41 boats in the 7 years between 1959 and 1967. The fleet became known as the 41 for Freedom. The classes were George Washington, Ethan Allen, Lafayette, James Madison, and Benjamin Franklin. Most served for decades. Many were converted later to carry the larger Poseidon and Trident missiles. By the late 1970s, the Polaris itself was being retired, replaced by the longer-ranged, more accurate multiple-warhead Trident missile aboard the new Ohio-class submarines. The progression of the missile itself tells its own story. The Polaris A-1 had a range of about 1,200 nautical miles. The improved A-2, deployed aboard the Ethan Allen class beginning in June 1962, extended the range to 1,500 nautical miles. The A-3, deployed in September 1964, reached 2,500 nautical miles and carried 3 re-entry bodies that spread the warheads across a single target area to defeat enemy missile defenses. The Poseidon C-3, deployed in March 1971, introduced multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, allowing one missile to strike up to 14 separate targets. The Trident missiles that followed pushed range to over 4,000 nautical miles, allowing American submarines to patrol the deep oceans far from any known approach route, beyond any plausible enemy detection. But the architecture, the doctrine, and the strategic concept all trace directly back to the work of the Special Projects Office in the late 1950s and to the moment on July 20, 1960, when George Washington proved that it could actually be done. The cost of all this was enormous. The Polaris program, taken as a whole from 1955 to 1967, consumed roughly $11 billion in the currency of the time, more than $100 billion in modern terms. By the accounting of the political scientist Harvey Sapolsky, who later wrote the definitive study of the program, it absorbed close to 7% of the Navy's total budget in some peak years. It demanded almost every ounce of technical talent the service could muster, and yet, by every reasonable measure, it delivered. The program met its accelerated schedule. The first deterrent patrol was conducted on time. The technology worked. The deterrent held. The question that historians have asked ever since is why this particular program succeeded when so many large defense efforts of the same era ran years late and billions over budget. Part of the answer is the people. Raborn was a brilliant manager, willing to break institutional rules to get results. Smith was a quiet engineering genius who insisted on solid fuel and on rigorous testing. Burke was a chief of naval operations, willing to spend his political capital to protect a program that other officers resented. Teller was a physicist willing to make a public promise and a laboratory willing to deliver on it. Draper at MIT made the inertial guidance work. Aerojet made the propellant work. Lockheed made the airframe work. Electric Boat made the submarine work. Each of these was a challenging engineering effort in its own right. Doing them all in parallel on a deadline that no one believed could be met was the genuine miracle. Part of the answer is the management system. The Special Projects Office created a planning method called Program Evaluation and Review Technique, PERT, which charted thousands of interdependent tasks across hundreds of contractors. Some historians argue that PERT was as much a public relations tool as a technical one, providing tidy charts that could be shown to congressional committees to demonstrate that the Navy knew what it was doing. But the underlying discipline of breaking a vast project into small pieces and tracking each one became a permanent contribution to American program management. PERT charts are still used in engineering schools today. Part of the answer is the geopolitical pressure. Sputnik scared everyone. The Gaither Report scared the president. The missile gap, real or imagined, scared Congress. In that climate, programs that delivered survivable nuclear retaliation received priorities and resources that simply would not have been available in calmer years. The Polaris received a priority designation called Brickbat 01, the highest emergency classification the Department of Defense could issue. That classification gave the Special Projects Office first claim on materials, on personnel, and on industrial capacity ahead of almost everything else the United States military was buying at the time. And part of the answer is that in this single program, the institutional culture of the United States Navy aligned perfectly with the strategic moment. The Navy needed Polaris to remain relevant in the nuclear age. The country needed Polaris to survive a possible Soviet first strike. The two needs reinforced each other. The result was a level of focus and determination that defense bureaucracies rarely achieve. None of these factors alone explains the outcome. Together they made George Washington possible. Together they made the most important demonstration in the history of submarine warfare possible. Together they made July 20, 1960 possible. The submarine herself served until January 24, 1985, when she was decommissioned and transferred to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard at Bremerton, Washington, for disposal. She had completed 55 strategic deterrent patrols. She had been refueled once in 1970 after roughly 100,000 nautical miles of steaming. She had spent more time submerged than almost any other vessel in the United States Navy. Her hull was eventually recycled at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, with the work completed on September 30, 1998. Her sail, the tall fin-like structure that rose above her main hull, was preserved and is on display at the Submarine Force Museum in Groton, Connecticut, just a short distance from the electric boat slipway where she had been built. Visitors today can stand beside it and look up at the place where, more than 60 years ago, lookouts had watched the open Atlantic in the moments before her first underwater missile launch. The men who served aboard her over her quarter-century career, an estimated 2,000 or more officers and enlisted sailors across both crews and many rotations, scattered into the fleet and into civilian life. Many of them, decades later, still wore small lapel pins shaped like silver dolphins, the mark of the qualified submariner. A few wore an additional pin, the patrol pin with stars added for each successful deterrent patrol. They did not talk much about what they had done. Submariners rarely do, but they understood what George Washington meant. They had been the crew that proved the concept. After them came the Patrick Henry, the Theodore Roosevelt, the Robert E. Lee, the Abraham Lincoln, and the rest of the 41 for freedom. After those came the Ohio class. After the Ohio class will come the Columbia class, the next generation of American ballistic missile submarines, each one a direct descendant of the design choices made in 1957 and 1958. The strategic concept of the survivable second strike, the idea that even total nuclear war does not allow an aggressor to escape retaliation, has held since 1960 without ever being fully tested. There has been no nuclear war between the great powers. There has been no first strike. There has been no use of strategic nuclear weapons in anger since August 1945. Many factors have contributed to that long peace. But every serious historian of the Cold War acknowledges that one of those factors is the certainty established off Cape Canaveral that summer afternoon. The certainty that nuclear powers can no longer be disarmed by surprise. The submarine is always out there, the missiles are always ready, the retaliation will always come. That certainty does not solve every problem of human civilization. It does not by itself prevent war between smaller powers. It does not eliminate proliferation. It does not lift the moral weight of holding cities hostage with thermonuclear weapons. But it has, by general consensus, made one specific kind of catastrophe much harder to start. The catastrophe of a nuclear superpower deciding that it can win a war by striking first. The lesson, then, is not really a lesson about submarines. It is a lesson about what disciplined urgency can accomplish. A small office of engineers, contractors, and naval officers, given clear authority and protected from interference, took a wild idea and turned it into a working weapon system in under 5 years. They worked against skepticism from their own service, from the Air Force, from segments of Congress, and from much of the scientific community. They built around technologies that did not exist when they started. They met a deadline that no one in Washington thought they could meet. And they delivered, on time, and largely on budget. There are not many programs in American defense history that can claim the same. Polaris is one of them. Every Ohio-class submarine on patrol tonight, every Vanguard-class boat in Scottish waters, every French triumphant, every quiet steel hull moving slowly through the dark, traces its lineage back to the design choices that produced one ship at Groton in the late 1950s. The men who served aboard her would probably not have used such grand language. Submariners almost never do. They would have said instead that they did the job they were given. They would have said that Polaris worked because the people who built it refused to accept that it could not work. They would have said that the deep is patient, that the sea keeps its secrets, and that on a certain afternoon in July, off a certain stretch of the Florida coast, the deep returned a single piece of those secrets to the sky. From out of the deep to target. Perfect.